Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the War Report, and we are back after a short leave of absence at my time. Don't worry, I was busy doing important work, and by that I mean doing no work at all. But it was a fun time. I got to briefly escape the American Empire. Now, yeah, continental Europe, blah blah blah. It is the American Empire, but I got to live on the periphery of it, and I'll tell you, being away from just Anglophone culture, even with as much as has tentacles around the world, it's a very nice breath of fresh air, even to the very controlled degree that it is. And I'm sure you, who have traveled to even more fringes of the empire, in fact, I actually traveled outside the empire, can attest to that. But I just need to start out the show with that, as we're going to get into a lot of news over the past, let's see, it's been about 2 weeks since we've done an episode, somewhere around there. Yeah, about 2 weeks. So, without further ado, I suppose we'll get right into it, and I'll turn it over to you to give us some battlefield updates because there's been a lot of happenings on the
Yeah,
ground in Ukraine.
there's been a ton, and frankly, we can't cover all of them. We'll cover basically what's happened in the last week, maybe as well as while you were away. But I'm sure you heard the Russians have captured Solidar,
Whoa, this is the first
and
I'm hearing of it. She
Ukraine
just
just
died?
admitted yesterday that it happened. Like 2 weeks after it happened, it admitted that it happened. Like, bro, when Prigozhin goes in one of the salt mines in Solidar, it's over. Like when whatever you think of him, when that bastard's in like one of the salt mines, it's over, right? He's not gonna go somewhere where he thinks like, oh my God, they could kill me at any moment. Not that it was incredibly safe, but he did not really have any threat on his life. Anyhow, people saw that and it was like an amazing PR move. And um, of course, Strelkov had to Chubby Strelkov. He gained weight on the trenches, while in the trenches, and he went back home. I think
True
the
Americanization.
the, the Russian forces told him to get lost. Dude, are you gonna fight or are you gonna tweet? Like, or post on VK, right? Anyways, he criticized Strelkov, and Strelkov asked him, like, hey, why don't you come back? You can join Wagner. So hilarious times, but yeah. So let's start with the front lines. And as customary, we will move from the south to the east and then to the north. Beginning in the south, it was relatively quiet the last few days. There were at least three attempts by the Ukrainians to cross the Dnieper River to land in Kherson. All of them were repelled. There were losses on the Ukrainian side, as far as I know. I don't know why they keep doing this. You remember back in the summer and autumn when they kept trying to cross the Dnieper and Zaporizhia to land at the nuclear power plant of Zaporizhia. I just thought this is so stupid. You guys are going to get wiped out, and they got wiped out every time. Like, you don't have an air force, you don't have as much artillery. Uh, Doing the crossing, even at night, is harder. Like, it's easy to defend against a crossing by boats, right? Anyhow, so they did it again. There was an island that was contested, but it's actually I forget which one. Quite honestly, it's not all that important. Now, the Russians have been shelling Kherson. There was some kind of a military depot that was shelled. The Ukrainians have fired back and hit residential areas in the Kherson area that's further south towards Crimea. And then this shows a kind of weakness in the Russian defense, in that by giving away that territory, which I admit was not easy to hold on to, they've made parts of the Crimea Peninsula more vulnerable. So far, even this was a small event. We haven't seen the kind of shelling that I think a lot of us were thinking was going to happen back in November. That's not there yet. Attempts to strike Crimea with drones have failed as well. Um, then there's an interesting case of the war front while you were gone in Zaporizhia. There seemed to be basically like 100-kilometer stretch. The Russian line went up. It captured a small town in the Dnieper on the west side of this contact line, and it captured a series of small villages, but they have not advanced further. And I don't know if our audience knows Weeb Union. Weeb Union does these like little updates all the time, and
That's a hell of a name, but do continue, please.
yeah, he's from Denmark, and it is in English, and most of them are frankly like 3 or 5 minutes long. Some of them are 8 minutes long. Very few are 10 minutes long. It's very neutral updates. Uh, Almost no editorializing at all. But he does predict from time to time, though not often, like Dima. I can't even watch Dima anymore, honestly. Like, I still remember in the summer, echoing some of his predictions, saying that this is what Dima thinks. Remember when he thought like the Russians were going to land like 700 helicopters and aircraft and cut off Odessa,
You held
and
out longer than I did. I'll tell you that much.
it
Which
was
it,
like
it
some of the stuff.
it's usually
And
the
then
other way around. I usually have much more tolerance to that kind of thing than you do. So I
I
have to
know,
point that out because
I
that's just
know,
a bit shocking.
I have almost no tolerance. You're right. You're right. But there were other ones. When the Russians were pushing into Kharkov, he was saying like, guys, I think the Russians are doing this just to envelop them. Now he seems to be more pro-Ukraine instead of pro-Russia, and like Solidar wasn't that significant. Well, he said it was significant, but the Russians, they're going to find it extremely difficult. Blah blah blah.
Well, not to speculate too much on the personal life of a guy who runs a military analysis YouTube channel, but to my understanding, I know that he's from Ukraine, but to my understanding, he's from that part of Ukraine that like just like goes back and forth depending on whoever has the upper hand.
Right, and as far as I know, he lives in Belarus now. I could be
That's
wrong. Maybe our audience knows. I don't know for sure.
that's
That's
that's a hell
one
of a
thing I've heard.
combination, but I just do have to also say on that note, you know who has been consistent not only about this war but every war and has provided just great coverage consistently for the past decade.
Sorry, I was just distracted. Can you repeat that again?
You know who has provided consistent great coverage not only for this war but pretty much every conflict zone in the past decade?
Who?
South Front, naturally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, South Front is good.
like I'll just say this: if you're ever in doubt about something, South Front is always a really good source to come back to check everything else against. Now, they're not infallible. They have put out some, let's just say, flops before, but their track record
Very
speaks for
few.
them.
Yeah, I mean they've had a few flops, but I don't know of how many.
Yeah, that I say that in terms of, and I don't necessarily fault them for this. They have predicted, especially when it came to their Syria analysis around the late 2010s, predicted a lot harsher escalation than what actually happened. Is what I would mean by that.
That's true. That's true. That is true. I noticed they're more cautious, especially the last few years, the last two. They don't. They even do some updates that are already kind of old when you compare them to Telegram. I think they want to be more sure of like what exactly has happened. Because you will get to it, but there's stuff going on in Iran right now that like started just an hour, 2 hours before we started recording. So, but to move along the front, Um, so people have speculated, including WebUnion, that this is not like a real attack by the Russians. This is basically to move the front line a little closer to the Ukrainians in order to preempt them. Because what they've done is they've had about three, some say four layers of protection so that Zaporozhye cannot be split in two. And that it's this land that they conquered, they're going to put defense lines like the kinds that the Ukrainians build behind them. So the other sort of factor that seems to support this theory is there aren't really that many of them pushing forward, and there aren't many of the reservists. There's still 160,000 reservists that are supposed to create three new divisions in the Russian army that are supposed to enter, but the vast majority of them are in Belgorod in Russia, that's right across the border from Ukraine, and in Belarus. There isn't any of the new equipment either. There is a buildup that the Ukrainians claim that is happening in southern Zaporozhye. That's true. However, I think these are the reservists that have come on board. The other 160 that were added back in the end of November and the beginning of December.
Yeah.
So now, as far as the Donbass front, we'll start from the south. And the Russians have, there have been conflicting reports about Ugledar, whether it's been surrounded or not. They've gone back and forth. Ugledar is one of these hotspots where, remember, there were these reports of massive Russian casualties, and it turned out not to be true. 2 days later, they captured that town directly south of Ugledar. Now, basically, they have Ugledar from the south and from the east. And from some reports that I'm seeing, about 50% of Ugledar itself, which is a small, it's not a city. I wouldn't say it's a small town. It does have it has quite a few high rises and apartment buildings. And it has in the east a kind of settlement of dachias, these little cottage houses, which most of it is occupied by the Russians. But the Ukrainians have been able to send forces there to keep it alive longer. It is very well fortified. There was also an interesting report on RT, and they showed one of the houses that where some of the Ukrainian soldiers were killed. The walls are all blackened from heat, but this bunker was actually built right underneath a house. You could never tell from the outside that there was an expansive bunker underneath, right, with concrete walls and whatnot. So I imagine that Ugledar is the same. The front near Donetsk city, Marinka, is about 70 to 80% taken. It too is fortified that way. So it's literally house to house, street to street. But I think overall, the overall picture is the Russians are making gains, and they're making gains not just in one area, but in several areas. And the biggest area where they're gaining is in the direction of Bakhmut, but also a little bit today in Gorlovka, on the outside of Gorlovka. Gorlovka is a town, it's a small city just north of Donetsk city. And like Donetsk, it had like the partition running right at its edges. And, the gains that the Russians have had around Bakhmut have increased. Like every day there is a new gain. After they took Soledar, about 2 days later, they took Sol, which is a tiny little town right next to Soledar. But then they started moving north and a lot further north. So now the Russian front line is as close to Seversk in the north as it is to Bakhmut. So they've gone halfway from Bakhmut, from the north of Bakhmut. When you left, they barely had like the outskirts of Soledar. And the reason, I think part of the reason it's taken so long, besides the entrenchment, is that the Russians, or in this case Wagner, they're attacking strictly from high ground. So they're going to capture high grounds and then fire down. They apparently did some tricks as well, where they stormed in at night and took over certain buildings. There were massive losses. I would say there were severe losses for both, but it looks like there were more losses for the Ukrainians, and you would expect that, given the fact that the Russians have more MLRS systems and more artillery systems in that area. And just based on the footage that I saw, one of the most harrowing things I saw was a building from which Ukrainian soldiers had jumped. Now, it's only 5 stories high, but wow. Pretty brutal. One of them got caught on ironworks in front of a window. You know, those ironworks to protect from thieves breaking in. Just
Yeah,
quite
the
something.
Chicago bars.
Yeah,
But
yeah. He was impaled on one of those. Just really gruesome stuff. And they've taken over. Let me get my notes. Another town in the Solidar Bakhmut direction. Um, yes, Blagodatnoye. So now taking over Blagodatnoye, they have now crossed over um, the road that links Seversk to Bakhmut. Remember, I said now the front line is no longer just stuck at Bakhmut and Solidar. It's halfway between Bakhmut and Solidar proper. Um, Everything on the west side of this highway is a valley. There's about a 50-meter elevation on the other side. So it's the Russians are probably going to be focusing more on Krasnogora, which part of it is already taken. There's some high ground there, so the probably a chance that they're going to skim along the top of Bakhmut on the north, and then go on a northwestern angle to try to take those strongholds instead of rushing across the farm fields. It's not a particularly long distance, but video footage has been released. While the Russians were fighting in Solidar, the Ukrainians were building these trenches. So I think they've been expecting this for quite some time. There's this conscription going on in Ukraine, and it is basically, I think, to fill in the gaps.
oh, this is like the
Um,
8th or ninth mobilization to the point where
yeah,
not only are they bringing in the 15, 16-year-old men, but they're actually working with embassies across quote unquote friendly nations to try to facilitate diaspora coming back and being conscripted into Ukrainian forces. And you had a Polish general over the course of the past week and a half suggesting that Ukrainian refugees be armed, equipped, and trained and sent back into the fight.
right. And Ukraine has actually asked for governments to hand over their young men to come back. Now, I think, you know, the Russians pretty much destroyed the first Ukrainian army back in March, April, May. This is what forced the West to supply more weapons. Um, and it honestly, the missile strikes from the Russians and some of the airstrikes have nullified the ability for the Ukrainians to repair their tanks in large numbers. Um, and they can't stay at these areas for too long. They have to constantly move around in order to not get detected. So this has made logistics far more difficult for them. Um, we'll get into the arms package, the latest arm package of this year, but suffice it to say, I think the mobilization that they completed back in the summer, late summer of last year, the Ukrainians, that allowed them to outnumber the Russians in a significant way. The Russians were always outnumbered, but not significantly. It was more like 2 to 1, 2.5 to 1. But I think, before the Russians mobilized and the Ukrainians did mobilize, they outnumbered the Russians, particularly in the north around Kharkov, and then finally in Kherson, which took a long time and a lot of lives, but they got it. And this to me doesn't feel like that. Assuredly, I know that in Poltava and Dnipropetrovsk that they are building new regiments that are going to try to break Zaporozhye in two in order to cut off Crimea from the Donbass. This is probably why they are demanding the tanks. But um, if people have been paying attention to this war closely, they know that the vast majority of reserves are going to Bakhmut. And when the Russians are taking, 10 kilometers, moving the front line to take over a few villages, what they're doing is adding pressure to divert attention and manpower away from Bakhmut into another area. I think Ugledar is probably more of a serious offensive because taking Ugledar will allow them to more effectively take over Marinka. Um, Whereas I think Zaporozhye itself is, Zaporozhye city is a major city. It's as far as I understand, it's bigger than Mariupol. Um, the logistics to get to it are more difficult. I don't think that's like a major push. If there was, it would only be in coordination with a much larger push. Maybe that will come in coordination with the 160 manpower armored divisions that the Russians are creating. And I'm guessing, word has it that they're actually not going to have a winter offensive. Why, I don't know. I think part of the answer could be that these are armored divisions, so they're training personnel on tanks. They want a lot of tanks, but a lot of this is all in the north. It's not in the south. So I don't know. Um, but lastly, I will say this: much of the front line, the, the Russians have made other gains south of Siversk to begin kind of enveloping it, and the forest, the literally it's the Sherwood Forest. The Russians have finally made a few more gains, bringing it further south. There's still the question of crossing the Donetsk River, of course, but that's another issue altogether. But the line, the Liman Kupiansk line running north and south is still largely static, except for some cool videos of the Russian Terminator in action, which is an incredible machine. Um, there isn't really that much going on there. It seems most of the fighting is in Zaporozhye, Bakhmut, Donbass.
Yeah, in a way, I would say this feels much more like the beginning of the war rather than the approach to the 1 year anniversary of the war. That things seem to be falling back into place after the Russian setbacks from the, let's see, that would have been like August, September, October Ukrainian counteroffensives. That after that you had November, you had the Kherson Clown Show once again, and then after December, after we got through this in these past few weeks, you are starting to see the Russians perform like many were expecting in the opening phases of the war.
Yeah,
Although it is,
and they did.
yes,
To be fair, they did. They eventually became outmanned, but in the initial phases, they did. There were heavy losses where they were outmanned in the north, but generally speaking, they made very, very rapid progress.
yes, and that's rather impressive considering the manpower disparity between the two countries, especially considering how much Russia, or I should say how little Russia dedicated at first because of the confines of the quote unquote special military operation and everything else in there. And that doesn't include the Donbass militias that have been fighting this war for the past 8 years. And I'm also not sure how that would include a lot of the Wagner guys because they are private military contractors and how exactly that does fit within the confines of that. So you do start to get murky there. There's the estimation of upward from anywhere from 500K to 750K Russians on the ground now, and then there's the alleged proposals coming out of Moscow that that number needs to be increased to 1.5 million. So we can get into numbers autism all day, and as much as I'd love to, I don't want to bog down the show too much. But I would say just as a final thought on the front lines is just seeing a bit of the footage that comes out, and I'm far from the first person to make this observation. The fact that it has devolved back into a second generation warfare almost, with a storming of the trench lines, with a going in, clearing out, moving gradually, and with such a long stretched out front. So I don't think anyone would have really expected that just in terms of a retrospective of the war in general. But moving into winter and with things finally really starting to set into that deep freeze where you can actually move the heavy equipment across the road without getting it bogged down like it does sometimes in the late fall, early winter. It's going to be interesting, and I'm going to be really curious what this war looks like at the year anniversary. And as I said in our year in review show, I'm going to really reserve any overall retrospective or judgment of the war and the performance therein until the year anniversary.
Right. I think one of the reasons people had the impression, um, like people had expectations of this war based on the fact that most of the footage that they saw that they thought was exciting was not happening in Donbass, where the entrenchment was. But the trenches have been there all along, and taking Donbass was always going to be like this. It was never not going to be like this. But because the Russians made so many gains in Kherson and Zaporozhye, and then in the north momentarily because they thought it would like work out for their peace talks. Um, that wasn't the case, right? Because of course everybody wants to know what's going to happen to the capital city. That's where the attention was. The news media does not ever want to talk about the situation in Donbass, particularly what has been happening there the last 9 years. So I think the expectations were very different because they were based on low information and a lot on presumptions. But these trench systems, they were developed 8 years ago. They constantly make new ones, and it was always going to be like this. They're strategically placed on high ground. Various apartment buildings and houses are turned into sophisticated bunkers. Uh, we got a foretaste of it, I believe, in Mariupol. But taking the rest of the Donbass was always going to be like this, with the exception of Lugansk, where it seems like the defenses were not nearly as well developed by the Ukrainians. But they certainly are from the east in
Yeah.
uh, in the in the Donetsk Republic.
And with that much on the battlefield out of the way, I do have a few other news items relating directly to Ukraine before I get into just general European news. And what I want to start off with is the several Ukrainian ministers that have resigned within the past 2 weeks. And again, these are all across the cabinet, all different kinds of positions. Even Arestovich has found himself on the wrong end of the Mirovets list. So that is after his comments about how the Ukrainian forces are becoming increasingly incompetent and how the Russian forces do seem to have been taking the upper hand. Apparently, I think I don't know. They put him on there for something really stupid. I think it was like defeatist propaganda or something along those lines. But the amount of resignations from the Ukrainian cabinet in this past stretch of about a week and a half, 2 weeks, reminds me of what we had right before both the resignation of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. Now, seeing as it is a completely different scenario with the British and the Ukrainian governments, and that Zelensky is going to hold on to power for dear life, and that there's not really anything I think that can be done to shake him through this. And I believe, let's see, Ukrainian elections every 5 years, so he wouldn't be up until for
They're not gonna.
no. Okay, okay, quote unquote elections, but yeah, I'm not anticipating a. Look, I'll put it this way: I'm not
Okay,
a pissed.
I know you weren't. I know you weren't.
Yeah,
I
I.
just can't
But
help it.
I will put it this way: I disagree with you insofar as there won't be an election. I think there will be a Ukrainian election, but I think it's going to be a one candidate election, or like
Yes.
it's going to be like what people used to make fun of Iraq and Libya for when it comes to the outcomes of that election. Is my personal prediction on it. If Zelensky makes it through the rest of this year and into the next year, which the hell if I know at that point. Who knows what is going to be that. He could turn tail and flee the country, and again, a lot of that's going to be contingent on the state of this war if it's concluded within this year. Which, once again, I don't even want to venture down that road because I wouldn't even know where to begin with that. But you do have several ministerial resignations this
Hmm.
week, which certainly does not spell confidence
And
for
dismissals.
for the state of the government, especially also once again, I know he's a bit of a walking meme, but I mean Arestovich being on the chopping block and being on the wrong side of the Mirovitz list, the man who is supposed to be this trusted presidential advisor, it's it doesn't bode well for the Ukrainian force, and that's on top of all the demands for aid and the aid announcements that did come this week. You'd had Germany finally coughing up the Leopard tanks that Ukraine has been demanding. You had the U.S. pledging the Abrams tanks, which I will get into some of the detail about that after I just get through a few more of the Ukrainian news items. You've had an increase of volunteers primarily on the Ukrainian side, but even a few on the Russian side. There were some volunteer battalions that included Poles and Macedonians that were fighting
Yes.
for Russia. Uh, I think it was at the capture of Solidar that they had like footage of them, which and I think there were some Bulgarians in there too. Just a grab bag of. I mean, it really is. I know at
It's
the
the
big.
Macedonian Redemption Arc.
Yes,
But
yes.
the reason they've joined is word has it Putin has guaranteed Macedonians Bactria. If they play their cards right, Bactria will be. That's what my brother and I keep joking around about. But
I mean, but I have said since the beginning of this war that I mean ultimately it's a blood feud between two Slavic peoples, that being Russians and Ukrainians. But it does seem to be increasingly growing into, and you saw this a little bit in 2014 with the volunteers on both sides. It's becoming a pan-Slavic ethnic blood feud playing out in the Donbass, which is while may not be newsworthy as a lot of the other items I'm going to discuss, it is a fascinating development nonetheless that you do see, and you even see a lot of splitting with. Of course, most of the Polish volunteers have gone this war, fought for Ukraine, but there is a notable amount of Polish volunteers fighting for the Russian side right now. And once again, if you want to get into the motivations of each, and that's a conversation for a different day, but I do think the
part of this actually, in case the audience is interested, part of this goes back to World War II, where Poles living in Lithuania who had a grudge against the Lithuanians sided with the Soviets. Um, I'm not suggesting these are Polish minorities from Lithuania. That's a possibility. That's not what I'm suggesting, though. I just think
Yeah, but it's
they
those
see the
kind of
danger
ethnic
of
grievances.
becoming an American puppet, basically,
Yeah,
and that it will destroy their culture, as it's sort of this destroying, say, Western European culture.
yeah, I would certainly agree, and I no surprise a lot of what you could identify from these Polish volunteers and people like that had very explicitly right wing symbols like and patches on their uniforms, so that shouldn't shock anyone when it comes to that. But this war, despite being the first conventional war between two major nations, really since maybe you could say Korea, but I would say World War II is probably the safest one to say. In many ways, it does take on a war of, say, pre 16th century, where you just have adventurers and mercenaries and people who are just itching for a fight, just coming from all over the world to fight in this thing. I mean, you've had everything from as disparate as Canadians, Koreans,
Japanese,
British, Japanese.
Brazilians.
It's all over the world. Virtually any country that has the means to get people to Ukraine has had volunteers for one side or the other, which is fascinating in and of itself, and I think it does spell, especially with the way nation states operate nowadays, does spell something for the future of warfare, that just handfuls of foreign volunteers coming in to fight a conflict that they have no ethnic, cultural, or even pragmatic ties to, from some greater dedication to an ideology, some love for foreign people, or once again just looking to experience war or go on some sort of adventure. I do find that fascinating, and I could honestly do an entire show about that, but I'll leave that aside for now. And in the rush to get more aid to Ukraine, you have the U.S. taking some very strange actions. I'll start with the diverting of arms shipments, because you had the U.S. opening up arms stockpiles. Now, these are U.S. owned arms stockpiles that are being stored in Israel. Now, we could probably all gather the reason why they're stored in Israel and why they would be there in that location. But you also have the diverting of arms that were meant from South Korea being sent to Ukraine as well. And you had raids of these stockpiles, because it falls under some sort of weird agreement with the way, with how many layers of bureaucracy and corruption are within the U.S. Department of Defense, both at home and abroad. They had to forcibly seize these against some sort of agreements. Now, of course, neither of these countries, and you don't even have in the case of Israel protesting this, because, I mean, despite Netanyahu coming back to power, despite a lot of the dynamics between Russia and Israel, a lot of the Israeli elite knows the score with this. They know that their future lies with the American empire, and what's good for the American empire is ultimately good for Israel, which is really much more of a backseat than they've taken, I would say, since 9/11, because we've discussed this, we've discussed the Zionist influence on American foreign policy, and while it was always there since the 1940s, it has taken a forefront since 9/11, and that during the Cold War, when there were much more pragmatic concerns at hand, that their interests sometimes had to take a backseat. And you start to see this again, and I do think that the Jewish Zionist elite in America and the Jewish Zionist elite in Israel both see the writing on the wall. They know what has to come first, even if it is at the expense of Israel's absolute and every desire. That Russia fundamentally is not a reliable partner, despite what some may have thought. China is not a reliable partner, despite what some may have thought. And that in order for a Jewish state to survive, in order for the Jewish state to make it past its 77th birthday, which I think it's somewhere within like 78 to 80 when you look at the like
Yeah, something like
historical
that.
Israelite kingdoms, even like going all the way back to the biblical era. They usually didn't survive that long, and I mean I know why I think that is, and I know that we have very diverse audience, as that may make our let's say handlers happy, putting that out there. But that's beside the point. But whatever you may want to attribute that to, I believe even among a lot of the more atheistic Jewish crowd that even that triggers some anxiety, that the fact that they are approaching that sort of mark there, even if some of them are less inclined to believe that sort of metaphysical angle about that. But you do have I mean, South Korea was ultimately going to fall. I don't think anyone's shocked at that. South Korea is probably up there with Germany when it comes to just complete vassalage to America, where they're not really going to question anything that comes out of the American Empire. But you do have with that
Well,
the go ahead, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say that, the Israelis and the Americans had their largest air defense exercise. And, there's speculation that there were two or three cities in Iran, including Isfahan, that were attacked, a military base, no less, where ammunitions were kept. And that just happened tonight. And then this comes on the heels of this huge Air Force exercise between Israel and America. Sullivan and Burns are both in Israel now, and Blinken, I think, is supposed to show up on Monday or Tuesday. So there's something really big there. And there was also another article that I skimmed through saying that essentially saying that Israel is actually on side with Ukraine, and but we're limited because of Russia's presence in Syria and their cooperation with Iran. Sounds like very much a logical answer.
Oh, absolutely. And just discussing the Israeli position, especially with the Syrian and Russian presence in Iran, that we've talked about this at great length before. Israel is not in a very stable position despite a lot of the clean break stuff that came out with the subduing of Jordan and Egypt, keeping them in their back pocket, especially through the amounts of U.S. presence and aid in the region. But they were never able to secure that northern flank. Hezbollah is as strong as ever. Syria, despite the war, has been stabilized and allows Iranian and Russian forces to operate there. Iran, despite everything going on right now in Iran, whether that be the protests or some of the acts of terrorism or some of the sabotage going on, which we will get into a little bit later in the show, is still holding out. And I do think that they're trying to shift attention to Iran, trying to take out the weakest link when it comes to that pact between Russia, China, and Iran, that they're ultimately the first ones that they would be able to collapse, if anything, which is why you have this meeting between Sullivan, and you expect Blinken and other U.S. officials to arrive in Israel soon. And again, something is brewing. What will actually come of it is really anyone's guess at this point. That's probably a topic for next episode. But yeah, when it comes to Ukraine and Israel, the fact that Israel is pro-Ukraine, it shouldn't really shock anyone at this point. I mean, even going back to the outbreak of the war in the Donbass with the separatist movements, you had Azov guys with Israeli weapons all the way back in 2015. So
Hmm.
it's been one of those things where they are operating in a limited capacity simply because of pragmatic concerns. But ultimately, we know where they stand in this, and we know what direction they're going to continue to take. Now, on top of the seizing of arms from both Israel and South Korea, you do have the U.S. making a proposition to Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela to have them provide their Soviet weapons to Ukraine in exchange for being reimbursed by the U.S. with updated American weapons. Now, these are countries that we heard about as recently as, I believe, even the Biden administration at this point, about how these are countries that are acting contrary to U.S. interests and that they have to be dealt with harshly because of whatever. Now I know that Trump tried to do that Latin American adventurism briefly in 2018, 2019, especially when you had the whole Guaido is the real president of Venezuela and we're recognizing his government in exile, whatever. And then he also undid a lot of the thawing of relations with Cuba, and he also did implement sanctions in Nicaragua. But all these countries that even you saw the Biden administration try to crack down on before the Russia-Ukraine war have been made this what can only be called sweetheart deal. Now, I don't think it's actually going to come to this. I don't think in any imaginable sense that they would allow that. But even when it comes to the oil issue, you do see them offering more lenience on Venezuela and trying to get them to provide oil and work past the sanctions, the restrictions that have been put in place by the U.S. there. But I could see U.S. raids to seize those stockpiles from countries that have much less capacity to fight back in order to supply this war in Ukraine as long as they're still dedicated to this project. But it could be that we don't want it to tap into our arsenal, which I mean, we already have. We're sending Abrams tanks on top of the Germans and various other Europeans sending the Leopard tanks. But it does show that there's one of two possibilities here. Either the U.S. is facing a genuine arms shortage to the point where they can't send it to Ukraine, or they're becoming stingy because they're anticipating getting involved in a conflict themselves. Not necessarily Ukraine, and as we were discussing, it could be Iran, and I'm starting to lean more towards if there's going to be any major U.S. military action within the next few months, within the course of the next year, it probably is going to be targeted at Iran, given the direction things are going, or even preparing for a larger conflict with China, as we'll get into one of the memos that was put out by the Defense Department later in the show. So
Yeah.
it does seem that there is a bit of a shoring up of U.S. assets in anticipation of a more direct action on their part, but they are stripping everyone else of their weapons, demilitarizing them, to send them to Ukraine in order to continue to put fuel on this fire, which I would say, and I am inclined to say actually, is a bit of a sign of desperation, but it does show that ultimately this is going to end within the course of, I would say, 2023, with Ukraine folding or with a major escalation. Now, that's not necessarily a direct American involvement, but for example, if Poland gets involved, or if they cut off Kaliningrad, or something along those lines, that would be the next logical escalation that would justify, say, that 250,000 troops of Russia sitting in Belarus right now, or perhaps in the Caucasus. We're getting some news about the Caucasus, or even Kazakhstan. That there will be some sort of major escalation over the remainder of this year if Ukraine does not fold with before the end of the year.
Right, right. I think we're going to find out in the spring where the direction of this war is going to go. I would say by the end of April. Um, I want to say though, just to go back, we briefly talked about other countries helping the U.S. send armaments and ammunition to Ukraine. Uh, America courted Brazil. Lula, was just elected. Maybe he wasn't. I don't know. And we talked about how
Point being is in power, but
Russia gave him tacit support, but not overwhelming support. Um, but there's been two developments. So the first one, as I already implied, he was asked if he could ship over munitions from the Soviet era. Those are the most needed because that is still represents the kind that the Ukrainians are using as far as howitzers. That's going to change as they lose more and more. But Lula said no. The other important thing in the news about Brazil is Lula is working with the Argentinians to create a common currency. I don't know. I'm not an economics guy, if that's a good thing or not. I would argue that that's basically to stave off the ability of the Americans to seize assets and all kinds of things. Because in a way, I've always believed that the Russians intentionally left some of these assets. Some of, like, okay, some of these assets that are left in Western banks are from private individuals. Um, maybe they didn't realize what was going to happen. I don't know how they wouldn't realize that this was going to happen. But I've always believed that that purse that's there, that they're slowly going to take, is going to be to rebuild Ukraine, and that is, it could be a stepping stone for a kind of a situation that you have in North and South Korea. Um, with a demilitarized zone running, I don't know. We don't know. The other bit of news, we were talking about Israel, and of course, Russia's been disinvited from the Auschwitz Museum. Now, um, I saw some articles where the Russians were quite upset about this. Um, I wouldn't take it too seriously. I mean, there is speculation that the Russians are helping the Iranians develop nuclear arms. So a lot of this is just, these are surface arguments. Uh, when you look at what's on the ground and what is happening, Russia is doing stuff that Israel doesn't like and that a lot of Jews don't like.
And that
But
actually it reminds me of something you had brought up, the Auschwitz Memorial and the feuds with Israel right now. That I've seen several of the Anglophone Russian sphere that I keep up with, and that would include several people. But just to give you a prominent example, someone like an Anatoly Karlin, that not only him,
yes,
but
that's what I was going to get
yeah,
to.
I've seen others saying that they predict, which I thought was ridiculous at first, but I'm starting to kind of buy into that shift for
Yes,
a certain 20th century atrocity, let's just call it that, blatantly shifted from Germany to Russia gradually in order
not
to
even
further the narrative.
communism, Russia.
Yeah, but yeah, Russia as a nation, and going back with its history of anti-Semitism, 1905, the pogroms, blah blah blah, that they will shift that blame to them, not even like being party to it, but as if it were their actions. And uh, I mean, let's just look at the purpose there. Germany has been completely subdued. This war has proven it. There's no more need to browbeat Germany. Now they'll do what they can. They will keep Germany under their boot, but in terms of narrative purpose, there is no motivation not to shift the blame to Russia in this and to continue on forward with that. And you'll probably see more tell-all documents that come out showing that, well, did you know that Russia actually operated these camps too, and blah blah blah, and they'll trudge up something.
Yeah. Now, did you know? I don't know if you noticed, but back, I think it was 2018, might have been even as early as 2017. There were celebrations in Normandy, right? And this was in connection with the Normandy Accord. It was like an appendage to the Minsk agreements, and it was like a forum where they could talk about Minsk and the enforcement. And now we, of course, know that all of this was a lie. That virtually every Hollande, Merkel, all of them have come forth and said that it was all a ruse. They were never serious about it. Ukrainian leadership has also stated that it was a ruse and that they were never serious about it, even though this was ratified by the UN Security Council, right? Like, you're supposed to take the UN seriously, right?
Yeah, it's your
The
pet
UN is
project, and
kind of like an
yeah,
appendage of the US, basically. But if you remember, Russia was disinvited from the D-Day celebration, right? Um, and you even have like more YouTube channels, Stalin, it was Stalin's fault all this happened. Um, so you're seeing more and more of that. And when you couple the pressure that's necessary to shift, particularly the right wing, because it's their men that are the most likely to go and fight in wars, are right wing men. It's particularly important, right, to give to cede some ground on, if not the Holocaust narrative, but the Holocaust um, memorization or the Holocaust reverence. Something like a bone has to be thrown to these guys. And in hindsight, it make like what Carlin predicted makes sense. But I'll go one step further. I'll go one step further. Back in 2014, 15, when I had an account on Google Plus, and I was in various chats and followed various accounts, including I did not even know who Andrew Anglin was, but like a few years later, I would find out. Anyways, um, I saw this break not only between like the whole World War II sides were you on, and World War II never ended, and blah blah blah. It doesn't matter if global homo is protected. Partly, it partly protects um, these right wing um, groups that we're on the side of the Nazis in World War II. I mean, you and I both know on this show that the only reason they're tolerated is because of their hate for Russia. None of these groups could even hope to exist without being jailed and imprisoned and
Gladio
impoverished
nationalism, and
in Paris, London, or
yeah,
New York. Like just so if you're a new listener, we understand this, right? Like we were one of the only podcasts that talked about this early 2018. Anyhow, so there's been a plethora of like pagan and semi-pagan performances in churches that after Zelensky's sort of outlawing of the canonical Orthodox Ukrainian Orthodox Church, including one of the Lavras in Kiev, you're getting pagan ceremonies. Now, some of them, they sing songs, killed the Moscow, killed the Russian, killed their babies, this kind of thing, which you only saw in protests in Kiev, where they chanted this, the Moscow on the knives and all this kind of stuff. But now you're seeing it's almost like a fanaticism that's really being unleashed. And the latest one that I saw was at a Greek Catholic church in Lvov. The architecture is like a blend of both East and West. And they're doing this bizarre ceremony. They're like walking around in these robes. Now, the robes aren't red, so it's obviously not like eyes wide shut, but they're wearing these ridiculous robes, right? And so one of the other divisions in the right that I saw then, and even Jonathan Bowden talked about it, this irreconcilable division in the Western right between pagans and Christians. And I mean, in the Spenglerian sense, I see this as the civilization going back to, in its decline, it goes back to its original tensions and formulations, which would have been like the very early Middle Ages, the very late Dark Ages. But so you see this. So why is this happening? Right? I mean, okay, there are like true believers. In some of these chats, I actually spoke to guys that belonged in some of these militias, right? Um, but it's taken off, and they know that this audience is going to reach like a lot of people in Sweden, a lot of people on the right in Sweden that are also pagans. They have been fervently on the side of Ukraine. They still believe that like the gay global homo is going to give them like a little ranch where they can have their pagan ethno state and
oh,
all of
not to
that
mention
if they
Swedes.
just do the favor of defeating Russia, right?
Swedes still have a grudge going back to the 18th century regarding Russia,
Oh yeah,
especially a lot of, for lack of a better term, petty nationalists really have just this blood feud against Russia the for the Northern War, and which is a strange combination with with the pagan elements. It sort of blends together into just an amalgamation of what can be broadly called Swedish culture. But yeah, you have this great point that, well, look at the modern state of Sweden. Sweden has been the butt of all these right wing jokes and also a great deal of sympathy just with how hellish their country has become in the past few years. That these rightists, while Sweden is becoming Swedistan, you can enact your ethnic feuds against the Russians over in Ukraine in service of the American Empire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in a way, like the funny thing about nationalism, is of course nationalism was a tool that particularly the Western powers, including England, used in the 19th century, right, in order to balkanize regions. And you have um, um, you have the same kind of thing developing now, right? It's a kind of useful nationalism for larger, stronger countries that have far more financial and economic strengths than the countries who romantically are um, pursuing this vision of their independent state. Uh, but it's how can I put it? It's the likelihood of that happening for many of these countries is like almost next to nil because they're only going to empower like the people who like give them the simulation of being um an independent country, but they're not. Just because like your interests align here does not mean they align everywhere, right? Like um, Sweden is not going to decrease its immigration in any significant way or kick out the Muslims because they're helping Ukraine beat Russia in Ukraine. Like that's not going to happen. That will not change anything for your own country. I mean, it might, you know, uh, take attention away from it. Might feel nice, but it's not going to achieve anything. Like Anyways, I don't want to uh, keep going in this direction. I think I made my point.
Yeah. But getting into just the final thing about the Ukrainian aid before I get into uh, more of our European news. So you have these pledges of Abrams, you have these pledges of Leopards, these armor pieces. But one thing that's called into question, and as we saw with some of the statements about Latin America, they're also trying to funnel these Soviet arms into Ukraine. Assuming these weapons actually do get shipped in the pledged quantities, how long will it take these Ukrainian forces that have been using Soviet weaponry since their training? And again, you even have like some of these guys who are 50s, 60s, probably even some experience in Afghanistan back during the Soviet intervention, if you really even want to go back that far. How long will it take them to get acclimated from their Soviet weapon systems to these American systems? And after a certain point, wouldn't it just become a liability? Would it not just become target practice for Russian forces to have these Ukrainians who have no idea what they're doing trying to drive these Abrams uh, and these Leopards and using Western artillery pieces, howitzers, whatever? After a certain point, wouldn't it just become Russian target practice and a liability for Ukraine to use these? Where I'm not saying that the West is just throwing this stuff away because I do think, I mean, I know for a fact that they do want to see Russia lose this war. They do want to see Russia dislodged and destabilized and have a crisis in government that leads to a perpetual weakening of Russia, much like they've done to a lot of these Middle Eastern countries. But it, I do have to really question what exactly is going on here. Are they sending the quote
Mm.
unquote advisors with them in order to help with these weapons? Because I can't imagine that they've dedicated throughout the past 8 years extensive training to Ukrainian forces on Western weapon system because they have been funneling supplies and training to Ukrainian forces since the Maidan, but again, that has been for the weapon systems that they've had. And most of the arms shipments they have received have been from other Eastern European countries with these Soviet stockpiles. It, and Bulgaria actually was one of the first ones to really be at the forefront of that, going all the way back to 2014. I know during the summer they threatened to cut off ammunition supplies, and they were particularly vital because they're one of the few countries left in the world that still manufactures the munitions needed for a particular, I can't remember the exact piece, but a particular piece of artillery that is a large part of the Ukrainian forces. So you have that, but it does make you wonder, is it that desperate where they're going to send over these Western arms and trainers in order to try to acclimate the Ukrainians to these things in time to try to even drive the war into a stalemate? Because, I mean, look, take Zelensky's word for what it will. I don't put much value in it, but he was saying, oh, if these tanks even arrive just if they don't arrive within the next 4 months, we're done for. And you had a lot of the projections for both U.S. and European aid looking to arrive in any significant number in August.
Yeah. Now, I largely agree with you. I'm going to push back just a little bit. I think they've been training Ukrainians on F-16s and on Abrams and Challengers for months now. Personally, like, I think the majority of the reasons why, Ukraine has, based on the mobilizations that they did in the summer and fall, particularly in the late summer in July and August, I would say. Um, this is the way their mobilization works. Okay, so they get older guys to go fill in the trenches to ward off the Russians from because of course at a distance the Russians don't know if these guys are well trained or not, right? And I would expect enough experienced guys to guide those guys that have no experience in every situation. No, no, there are going to be shortages. However, the younger guys, the guys that volunteer to be in Azov battalion or some other battalion that has a reputation, um, many of those guys get trained in Western countries, right? And the whole point of doing this is that they will go to those Western countries and they're going to be showered with all kinds of attention. And they're going to be told many, many great things about Ukraine and what Ukraine really means. Like there'll be like an almost esoteric explanation of like what Ukraine means. And a lot of that will um, confirm various biases. The other thing they're going to experience is like more money, training, hope, and the establishment of like a deeper friendship with the West, and maybe even hookers too. So, uh, so what'll happen is those guys will then come back, but in the interim, they need anybody and everybody that they can get to fill in the gaps, right? Until those guys arrive. While they're there, I believe personally, I can't confirm this, but personally, I believe they are being trained on American systems. Now, does Ukraine have like enough already semi-experienced tankers, right? That that even if they had the tanks now, right, they would be as effective as, say, the Russian tankers? I would say no, even though the tanks that they would get in many cases are superior, right? But there's also the question of quantity and quality, and Russia has more of it. Even the hundreds of tanks that were apparently lost in Kharkov during the offensive in September, it turned out less than a dozen were actually useful. So these tanks, basically, they were damaged. They either went over a mine or the cannon itself from where had to be repaired. Um, you're looking at only like 3 to 4% of those tanks were usable. Now, the rest were cannibalized for parts and everything, but you're still talking about like Ukraine lost nearly 2,000 tanks in the first 3, 4 months of the war, right? You would need at least, I would say, about 10,000 men if it's 3 to 4 per tank, depending on the tank, of course, to fill in what was lost. Because remember that the Kherson and the Kharkov offensive cost them a lot. They wouldn't be asking for more arms if it didn't, right? And those tanks were not all abandoned and nobody knows what happened to them. They were blown up. Over half were blown up. So, yes, they are being trained. They are probably going to see, you're going to see them in Ukraine sooner, but not all of them will you see sooner. And of course, there's the discrepancy with the Abrams, that they're not going to be given the Abram tank with the latest armor. Even CNN had an expert on saying that, this could be a great propaganda victory for the Russians if they show Western tanks being destroyed, particularly the Abrams. Um, the Russians, because of Syria, uh, and Yemen, are already aware of what are the weak points of the Abrams and the Leopard 2 tanks. They already know, and those tanks have been destroyed in both places using the Cornet anti-tank system that the Russians have developed. So they even know like what weapons will work on them. Um, Another way to look at it is if Ukraine had the they're given an initial package of 88 tanks. Can you believe it? Germany sending 88 tanks. What if they arrive on February the 14th or March the 14th?
Oh,
88 tanks.
even better.
So,
That's
yeah. So, um, I will say this: if they had them, and the crews had at least some months of training, I don't think you would have seen the kind of the Russians making the kind of gains that they have. I will go out there and say that. However, they don't. They lost them. Um, so yes, I think the tanks are important, but then they have to work in coordination with a proper air force, and this is why right after the tanks, the next day you started hearing about F-16s, right? Because like a lot of the reasons why some of the tanks, some of the Abrams and Leopard tanks that were destroyed by the Yemenis and ISIS, the reason that happened is because there wasn't sufficient air support. They weren't part of a combined arms tactical group that would have supported them. Those kinds of mistakes. On the other hand, the Russians have a lot more Cornet systems, and they have satellites, which ISIS does not. Well, unless America helped ISIS, that would not be new in order to make Erdogan pay.
interesting.
But in a way, Erdogan was kind of given permission by Obama. So I don't know in that case. I'm being flippant, but yeah. So 321 is the total that they expect to get from now till December of this year, and they're going to arrive piecemeal, right? And judging by how careful the Russians are not to lose any more aircraft after the first month, 6 weeks of the war from last year, um, I would say that the Europeans and the Americans are also hesitant. I don't think that means they're not going to do it, because I think the West right now is captured by a group that wants to go all the way. I think it's because they see no other way. They don't see a way to affect China by going directly against China. Not all of them think like that, and we're going to get into who doesn't. And I don't know if you want to. We could start by the article in the Rand publication,
Yeah.
if you wanted to.
I just do have some brief European news. I'll knock out
Oh,
before
sorry,
that.
sorry. I totally,
No,
I totally.
it's fine because that's quite interesting in itself. But yeah, I just want to knock just a couple of these things out of the way before we get too much into that. So on the topic of Germany, you also said the foreign minister Annalena Baerbock more or less declared war on Russia this week, saying that Europe is at war with Russia, which is a sentiment that was echoed across the political spectrum and across the views on this war. Because also echoing the sentiment was Orban and Milanovic and
Mhm.
Vucic all said something of the same. Now, all four of those individuals said it with much different tones. And I'll let you sort out who said what way. But Orban made some other interesting comments along with that, where he denounced the treatment of the Hungarian diaspora in Ukraine, along with Milanovic actually co signing his words. And he went as far as to say that the conscription efforts by Ukraine were a form of ethnic cleansing of Hungarians in western Ukraine. He had also
Mhm.
said that the West is at war with Russia and that this is a threat to Hungarian security first and foremost. So, despite some of the comments he made about Finland and Sweden and NATO, and you can tell by actually watching the way Orban speaks. Now, I don't speak Hungarian. I don't imagine there's many people out there in the audience who aren't Hungarian who have a grasp on that language because it is notoriously difficult for outsiders, especially coming from an Indo European background, to understand. But just judging by the tone of his speeches lately, and it could, I don't know, he's a politician, he could just be a very good actor. He does genuinely seem fed up with this. He does
Yep.
genuinely seem to have a visceral frustration whenever he talks about this conflict that he 100% believes in his heart of hearts that this war will spill over into Hungary and will threaten the security and livelihood and lives of the Hungarian people within the borders of Hungary, more so than already has its diaspora with that he has essentially mentioned in Ukraine as well. So he's a drop in an ocean of disagreement. He was only the only European Union leader to not go along with this. He has been responsible for stonewalling a lot of the more absurd actions out of the European Union, at least when it comes to the unanimous votes. It does seem that Milanovic, although Milanovic has much less power in his country, seems to be following suit in many ways. And well, I don't know when the next Croatian elections are, but we will see when that comes down the road what the people actually think because the president and the prime minister and parliament have been very divided in Croatia, whereas in Hungary you've had a bit more of everyone in the government is really in line with this, especially with Orban's most recent election results. Whereas Milanovic is the presidential figure in a parliamentary system, so his amount of power doesn't translate into much actual power rather than just him being a public figure. So, well, we can see the direction that does take, but you do have this block of nations across, I would say, Central to Southeastern Europe in general, and that includes Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, and even Bulgaria at this point, because Bulgaria has called on the West, the president of Bulgaria, particularly Radev, and once again, he's one of those politicians, one of those presidents that finds himself in the position where he doesn't really hold that much power himself, and that's vested in the prime minister, the cabinet, and the parliament. And he had called on the West to stop funneling arms in Ukraine because he also fears that escalation will be an inevitable result of this, that this will inevitably escalate into a global conflict if this does not stop. Which I would say he's correct that this eventually will spill over, that it's only a matter of time before another country would get involved in this. And on that same note of that block of countries forming in opposition to or I would say in tacit opposition to this war, is you have more comments from Milanovic saying, quote, maybe Germany is at war with Russia again. Good luck to them. Maybe it'll turn out better than 70 years ago. We are not at war with anyone. I don't know how many tanks will help Ukraine. Maybe it'll help them. Maybe they'll just burn like they did in Iraq. So that is a direct quotation
Wow.
from Milanovic. He look, I know we have some Croatian viewers, and I know one of them, and you know exactly who you are, who I'm talking to right now, is very entertained by the statements of Milanovic. And I would say he is becoming, and I don't want to speak too soon, but he seems to be becoming that perfect synthesis between Trump and Orban, where he's Orban on the important stuff, but rhetorically he's Donald Trump, which I couldn't ask for a better combination, personally. But
Yeah,
uh,
I mean, speaking of the tanks, I mean, really, it's not nearly enough. Like, I saw some figures from Western sources that claim over 2,000 Ukrainian tanks were taken out, and this is going to sound insane, but 14,000 armored vehicles. Now, these can be infantry fighting vehicles, APCs. There are these like rinky-dink BTRs, or are they BMPs? The ones with wheels that only have four instead of the six. Ukraine had a plethora of these, but the fact of the matter is, like, they will stop some small arms fire, not all. And you know, if the bomb blows up far enough, not all the shrapnel will get through. However, that is what they have lost, and that's according to Western sources. Uh, but they're going to need a lot more, which again comes down to the question: why is the West sending so few? Right? Is it because they want the war to go on for a long time? Is it because they suspect that the longer it goes on, the less able Russia will be able to fight? But that could also mean Ukraine will be less able to fight if they go on with these piecemeal gifts to the Ukrainians to fight off this war. You could even ask why didn't they stay? Why didn't they ship these arms sooner? When they were refusing to negotiate with the Russians, why not send them in then? Was it because they were unprepared to supply munitions? uh, I know there's talks now of building factories in eastern Poland in order to facilitate that. The escalation, I'm not saying there isn't going to be an escalation, but I'm saying at what rate. And, honestly, 300, like, you would need 321 tanks delivered right now, and it could not be dispersed in various units. They would have to be dispersed in one area where they could make a concentrated effort to push through Russian defensive lines. And it would only be enough for one. It would probably even be successful. I don't know for sure. I'm not a military expert, but that's how you would need it. But that doesn't mean they wouldn't lose ground somewhere else. So, in other words, they would still need much more of them. Even if they took some ground, how long can they defend it before they ask? Because right now, Ukraine is like on life support system, and the RAND document that was recently published is saying that, like, it's better for America to get out now. Now they claim that Russia is severely weakened, but so is Europe, but America less so. But if America stays longer, then America will lose valuable time with regards to China, even though, as I said, they've only mentioned China once. They talked about America's reputation and many other areas where America will be needed, so forth and so on. Um, then they claim the longer it goes on, even Russia could gain more ground. That's why it's better to sue for a peace treaty right now. or cessation of aggression for now. Um, you know, they might the Rand Corporation. They're not a corporation. Forget what they are. I mean, they're a think tank, and they do analysis, and they work very closely with the military-industrial complex in the U.S. And politicians, of course, read them very well, and and take their advice very seriously. The vast majority of them. So, what what are they going to do? Like, um, they would have to industrialize Europe, um, and that could take some time in order to really fight this war.
Yeah, that's
And
a hell of a position to put in now because Europe only just recently resolved its impending energy crisis by the loss of industry. Yes, they can keep the lights on. Yes, they can keep the heat on,
but
but
no industry.
at the cost of being industrial powers. I'm talking mainly France and Germany at this point. So it creates a hell of a situation that I mean American industry has fallen into disrepair in many areas that would take years, if not decades, to reverse that trend and repair a lot of just the decay of American industry since the 1980s, 1990s.
Yeah. I
So,
mean, I just think it's funny how they're saying Russia's severely weakened, but if also if the war goes on any longer, they could take more territory. Like those that doesn't make sense. Like, I mean, I get it. They can't say Ukraine is probably going to lose, or Ukraine is losing, or Ukraine cannot take any more ground right now. This would be a good time, and people have speculated that Milley, you know, as I said earlier, has spoken with the Rand Corporation. So there are growing doubts. But again, that doesn't mean things are going to go in a different direction anytime soon.
yeah, that's
Yeah, go on. But I think we should also talk about Victoria Nuland's.
of course. But I just do, and I can't help myself, have one last series of quotes from Milanovic. So he had some comments just regarding the war. This is from the 17th, saying, quote, Washington and NATO are waging a proxy war against Russia through Ukraine and vice versa. However, if you don't have the ultimate goal, if you don't have a plan, it'll end up like Afghanistan. And then he said he thinks it's very legally doubtful that the decision of the European Union for to be participating in the war, and that it's against the treaties of the European Union and it oversees activities outside the EU, so it's unlawful. So he's calling into question the even legal legitimacy of something like this working. And then he also said the plan cannot be to remove Putin. It cannot be sanctions. This is nonsense. We will not achieve anything. They didn't even break Milosevic with sanctions. They go from war to war. What should we be? American slaves? Is how that last series of comments ended. So,
Oh wow,
although you've
that's pretty
had,
big.
oh yeah, although you've had consistent anti-empire rhetoric and actions out of somebody like Orban, that is much more inflammatory. That
Yeah.
is much more accusatory. Even again, even in the thick of this war, you haven't had Orban say anything really that inflammatory. Now he has had his strong opinions. He has not made it hidden what his opinion on this war and Hungary's position on this war is, but he hasn't gone to that level yet. And arguably, although some may say it's dangerous, although some may say he is putting himself in a very unfavorable position that something is likely to happen to him soon because of those comments. Ultimately, somebody has to say it. Ultimately, somebody has to spark that. And I'm not optimistic, but the only chance you have of somebody, say, in France or Germany or one of the major players in Europe saying that is if it does start smaller somewhere. Now, although it was suppressed, although they did take down a lot of the nationalist movements throughout Europe, the only reason they had a shot in hell was because Orban walked so they could at least attempt to run. And that if you're going to have any continuance of this kind of rhetoric, it does have to come out of one of the peripheral nations like Hungary, like Croatia, like Slovakia, like Bulgaria, like again any of these handful of nations that really are an afterthought when it comes to the main structures of the empire. If you want, and I'm not saying it's guaranteed, but if you want any hope of rhetoric like that coming anywhere of Western Europe, it has to come from these smaller countries first that have more, let's just say, leeway to get away with these comments because there's less scrutiny on them.
Hmm. Um, in other European news, there's going to be a meeting that's taking, I believe it's Monday or Tuesday. It's going to happen in Brussels, and it's a collection of MPs throughout the EU that are ostensibly conservatives. Like, think of Merkel's party, the what is it, the Christian?
Yeah, the Christian Democrats, though, but the center right coalition of Europe is what you're gathering. I
Yeah, and so basically, their talk will be about the um, essentially the balkanization of Russia. They're calling it de-imperialization. And throughout it, they have a, I don't know if I sent it to you, but yes, let me get this. Yes, it's on January 31st, and it's called the European Conservatives and Reformists, the ECR, and they make it plainly open that a defeat in Ukraine will be financially beneficial to the EU because they're going to get all the goodies, right? If they destroy Russia in the process. What if they kind of win in Ukraine, but they don't destroy Russia? What then, right? Like, um, Russia didn't blow up your Nord Stream pipelines. America did, or one of you idiots did it for them. But like, you, America is not going to, like, I don't know what they're thinking. Like, um, you're on a chain now. Like, the leash has been significantly shortened. Like, what would have to happen is uh, the calamity of Russia losing in Ukraine would have to be so huge. And of course, this would mean losing Crimea. Because of course, if Russia doesn't lose Crimea, it still holds the advantage. Um, so if that happens, like, well, what then? Right? Like, what they're betting on is Russia doesn't lose Crimea, but they they do somehow in a magical way, and a guy like Navalny becomes president of Russia, and he says, "You know what? We're going to balkanize the whole country. You you guys in Yakutia, you get your own massive country. It's twice the size of Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan's twice the size of Ukraine, and et cetera, et cetera." Um, like, I mean, it's really delusional. It's really delusional. I honestly think that a lot of this kind of talk is really just to keep the spirits up. This focus on what we're going to do after the war, when the war is not even over. The war may not be over for a very long time. I mean, I've often said that I think this will be a forever war that goes hot and cold.
absolutely, and arguably that is exactly what they want now that they've realized that dislodging Russia is not a viable position. That they do want Ukraine, and they're even willing to expand that into other parts of Eastern Europe if need be, to be very similar to somewhere like a country like Syria or Iraq, where there is always a low intensity combat that may flare up every once in a while, but always that low intensity combat there enough to keep things just destabilized enough to prevent any real progress by Russia or anyone who may be against the interests of the American empire.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I it's amazing to me, like how out of touch these guys are. Like, uh, do they actually know? Like, I don't know. Maybe it's because they have so many, so few cross purposes that, and there's so much alignment in their goals that they don't see that they're on a short leash. I don't know.
I I wouldn't even know where to begin to guess with these people, but just the last couple pieces of European news I have before we get into some of the stuff out of the Rand article and some of the Middle Eastern news is that Estonia is allegedly planning to close the Gulf of Finland, according to Foreign
Hmm.
Minister Runsalu. Now, the Gulf of Finland is international waters. Any provocation that would be triggered by that technically would not be under an Article 5 defense if tensions between Estonia and Russia were to flare into any sort of open conflict. Now, I don't foresee that happening. Once again, it's these chihuahuas nipping at the ankles and barking at Russia. You get this whenever Lithuania threatens to cut off Kaliningrad, which, if we're being honest, Lithuania cutting off Kaliningrad is infinitely more likely than Estonia single handedly closing the Gulf of Finland vis a vis the Russian Navy. So, now, if there were somebody within the West, whether that be a US, UK, whatever, that were willing to throw their lot in with Estonia in order to continue on with this little pet project, that might be something. But otherwise, this is just a pipe dream. But while we're on the topic of the rabid chihuahuas known as the Baltic states, Russia has also expelled the ambassador of Latvia from the country. So
Hmm.
relations do continue to break down. It's no surprise that it would be from the Baltic states with the way they conduct themselves in regards to their approach to Russia and just European politics in general that one of them would have the first ambassador to be expelled. I mean, keep in mind you have the U.S., the UK, countries that have been agitating this war. Not even they've had their ambassadors expelled. Now, once again, that would be a sign of market escalation to expel an ambassador from a major country, but it does show that any slim chance of diplomacy is continuing to decrease. And like I said, I know Latvia is not really a sovereign nation in any sense of the word, but what it symbolically means is a lot more, and it does show that, well, okay, maybe this time it's Latvia, but next time it's a country that's a bit more up the totem pole when it comes to the American empire. Maybe next time it's not necessarily somewhere like I would say France or Germany's pushing it, but somewhere in between that levels. And I don't know, maybe like a Poland, which is a bit more of a major player in that regard. But point being is, you can see how something like this can eventually escalate to the breakdown in diplomatic relations between Russia and the major Western countries.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of countries now that are definitely moving away from the US dollar. Um, we've I think what 2022 revealed is a kind of trend that was already established long before. We've often said, and we're not unique in this way. Many have said, America has pushed Russia into China's arms and vice versa, and really, America's provocations in Ukraine have pushed the rest of the world towards Russia and China. So you have countries like India that are increasing trade. They're dumping the US dollar. Their trade with Russian oil and gas is no longer done in American dollars. They're done in rupees and rubles. Saudi Arabia already does a portion of their oil sales to China in the yuan, but they're considering increasing that. And I mean, what are they going to do? What is America going to do? They're going to invade Saudi Arabia? Um,
Now, if
This
you
is
believe some of the documents that have come out over the course of the past few decades, the U.S. allegedly had a contingency plan for the de-dollarization of Saudi Arabia that we have yet to see take place. Now, is it a question of have they not gone far enough yet? Do they still think there's a chance at talking this out? Do they simply not have the capability to do what they once did? There's a lot of questions there. But I feel like if that plan actually exists for an emergency regime change in Saudi Arabia, in event of the collapse of the petrodollar, we're going to see it sooner than later. And that if we don't see it within that sooner time frame, I don't want to give too much of a time frame. That plan was probably either not tenable to carry out or just did not exist in the first place.
yeah. Um, like I think in many ways this provocation in Ukraine, um, if it was well thought out, it was only well thought out in one direction, and it doesn't seem like there's a plan B in case it didn't turn out as they had expected. Because like obviously they expected Russia to economically collapse and go through a revolution. Like that's obvious, right? Based on their sanctions and everything else, that is what was supposed to happen. That didn't happen, and so now what? Um, um, if it had happened quickly, right, they would have had the whole world. China would have been terrified. China would have begun to comply. India would not have sided with Russia. Neither Saudi Arabia or Turkey. Turkey is this incredible wild card. Like, I mean, if Turkey had decided to go with the States, I don't even know if Russia could have waged this war. To be frank,
Well, it's
uh,
interesting that you bring up Turkey because there are a few things about Turkey, and I'll hold off on most of them. But I do want to bring that up in regards to sanctions. That the U.S. is sending one of their henchmen, one of their deputy secretaries of whatever department, who particularly deals with sanctions and international finance. He is going on a tour of Turkey, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates to quote unquote warn them on the dangers of evading U.S. sanctions vis a vis Russia. So it does look like that we're getting a continuance of American pressure on, let's just say, these more neutral countries, these countries that are more willing to play both sides in regards to this particular conflict about the consequences of going against the American empire's will. But once again, we're talking about a diminished American empire. And especially when it comes to a country like Turkey, maybe more so Oman and the United Arab Emirates have more that can be put, more pressure that can be put on them. But when it comes to Turkey, Turkey has already shown over the past several years that it can successfully defy the United States in very gradual manners. And they can, again, it increases every year, but they've shown that they can go up against the will of the American empire and come out relatively unscathed ever since that coup against Erdogan failed in 2016. And as we're coming up into the 2023 election in Turkey, I do think we'll see some interesting things out of that. And I'll hold off on the rest of the Turkish news for now before we get until after we get to this Rand thing. But I do have some stuff regarding Turkey and it rubbing up against the American empire and generally playing into its wild card status.
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I can just get into it now. If you, so you have the presidential office of Turkey saying that Ukraine would not be able to overcome Russia even with the aforementioned aid that has been divvied out this week. But more interestingly is some of the NATO politics that are going on right now. So Erdogan once again is holding out on the expansion of NATO, particularly when it comes to Finland and Sweden, and that is in regard to one of the Quran burnings that took place. That at least
Hmm.
that was the public reason given, and that has been stonewalled. But probably most interesting of what came out is you have John Bolton, who is trying to go on, trying to resurrect his career, going on this tour, making all these comments. One of the main causes he's championing right now is taking up the anti-Turkish cause and saying that NATO needs to expel Turkey if Erdogan is reelected this year in 2023, if he's reelected in the elections that are upcoming in May. So you have right here the wild card, one of the most pivotal players in global politics, especially with the climate right now, that the American empire has become so purist that it is willing to throw away Turkey, one of the most important members of NATO, second largest army in NATO after the US, unspeakably valuable strategic position
Location, yes.
vis-a-vis Russia. And I know John Bolton doesn't speak for the entire American empire. In fact, he's one of the more hardliners when it comes to it. But you do see this sentiment being echoed by even the more quote-unquote moderate voices that Turkey needs to be completely in line, or else we cast it aside and put it completely within the Russian sphere. And one of the worst strategic mistakes the West is making right now is that they are completely isolating Turkey, that they are not willing to address any of their concerns and continue to push them eastward. And this has been going on since 2016. This has been going on since Erdogan really came to prominence. And now, with the negotiations ongoing with Syria and the improving relationship with Russia, I've actually said this for years. I've been saying this since 2019, 2020. One of my biggest wishes is for NATO to expel Turkey because it is the linchpin
Mm.
on which NATO relies. If Turkey's out, there's no NATO. Sure, you have this block of European countries, but in terms of what NATO is in global power, what NATO is to the American empire, if you isolate Turkey, you've cut that at least in half. So I will continue to say, I hope Turkey gets expelled from NATO. I hope John Bolton gets his wish because that is one of the worst
I want
possible.
it for all the wrong
Oh,
reasons.
yeah, I exactly. I want it for all the wrong reasons because it is the worst possible outcome for NATO that they isolate Turkey. They're on that path right now, and it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's like LaBeouf saying, do it. Do it. Yeah, it's hilarious. Um, I think Erdogan has never forgiven for the U.S. for trying to assassinate him and take over his government. And
Yeah, that's not exactly a bygones be bygones sort of situation. So
yeah, and I think they blew it. I think they played themselves, and even though Obama gave him the tacit go-ahead in Syria, I think in many ways the Americans probably didn't want that too. It's hard to judge because they need the Kurds, right? And the basic express purpose of Turkey pushing into Syria was because he was afraid of just the amount of Kurds that were moving into that area. And I don't know if people know, but like that 1/3 of Eastern Turkey has a huge Kurdish population. They're the majority there, right? It's a big deal.
and yeah, when you
So
talk about like demographic futures, I'm pretty sure
yeah,
in terms of fertility rates, they are far above the average Turkish population. So it is a real time demographic crisis comparable to many Western nations. Now, a lot of people might not think about it because it's not directly Western, but it is comparable to the situation being faced by France and Germany with the Kurdish population in Turkey.
hmm yeah, and it's he's been an incredible asset to the Russians in this war. Um, I'm not saying Turkey, is controlling like what ships go in and out as far as NATO. Hardly, I'm not suggesting that at all, but I'm just saying that if Turkey had gone fully on board with NATO, this would have been very different. This would have been a war that would have escalated into terrifying territory very quickly, very, very quickly. Uh, but he hasn't, and I think he hasn't because a military victory over Russia in Ukraine does not really serve Turkey. He would be next on the chopping block. As much as he's in NATO, he does not want NATO to dominate the Black Sea. He wants Turkey to dominate the Black Sea. He will only even he won't even tolerate like the Russians controlling the Black Sea as much. But I think it's a question of he knows that if America wins this, he's on the chopping block. It's over for him. It's China realizes that, and even countries like India are slowly waking up to that.
Well, the American Empire has shown itself that in event of its hegemony continuing, that every country it deals with will eventually be treated like Germany. That has been shown to Russia, that's been shown to Turkey, that's been shown to India, that's been shown to China. That in event of any sort of downscale or defeat, Germany is their future, and that's not an optimistic future to look forward to. So they once again the American Empire has drastically overplayed its hand. That it has shown there can be no compromise with Washington. That their word is law, and I think that's been the driving force keeping at least a lot of these countries neutral, if not outright pro-Russia. And depending on the direction of the conflict, depending on how much more heavy-handed Washington becomes, I wouldn't be surprised if you start to see more of these countries start to be more openly pro-Russia.
Mm-hmm. It's not even just Orban's future, although that plays a big role. But what is Turkey's future with like an even more powerful NATO, EU, and America? Like, what good does that give it? Like, there's nothing advantageous about that.
And it also does
I,
make you question, like, who is the slated successor? Because it's clear they want Erdogan gone, but
yeah,
like, who do they have? Like, who's their guy that they're going to get in there that's going to be pro West, pro NATO, and be that thorn in Russia's side that Turkey is supposed to be in NATO strategy? I look, I'm not too well versed in domestic Turkish politics. I imagine there's probably somebody, but I can't put a name or a face to him.
yeah. I mean, I don't know. Certainly, it's not going to be Gulen, but I don't know.
It's almost disappointing that the West isn't going to put the weird Islamic like mystic guy in power who's been hiding in the hills of
Yeah.
western Pennsylvania for the past 30 years at this point. Yeah, yeah, just hand Turkey over to the Muslim sorcerer. I'm sure that'll end well. I'm sure he will be a great, reliable partner in all of this.
Yeah. I don't know what to say.
I mean,
But I mean, my own guess is that he is going to win it. Primarily because Turks really hate the U.S. They really honestly hate them, and they don't like the Europeans very much. And
which, keep in mind, that's a rather radical shift in opinion as to what it was even just 20 years ago when you had,
yeah,
although it like, although like the Turks weren't the most Ameriphilic people in NATO or in the world, they had a generally positive opinion, and that it's a relatively recent development for their disdain developing for Europeans and Americans.
yeah. Um, I just think he has his ear to the ground, and I think he knows that what Russia and China are working on, particularly with the integration of Central Asia, he wants a piece of that. Whether it's a gas hub, whether it's a lucrative deal with the Azerbaijanis for pipelines from there going into Europe, which hardly replace Russian gas and oil. By the way, I saw some statistics in the Times of England, of London, um, that showed that there was hardly a decrease of Russian oil and gas, not just in the UK, but in most European countries. There was more American, but there was hardly less Russian or oil or gas. Now, the thing is America's trying to clamp down on this, uh, you know, but we know that Turkey, like other countries, is mixing it, and um, I just think he's been courting that, Central Asia for a long time, all the way back in 2014 and 15. I remember watching videos of these like steppe nomad games, and of course the Hungarians are there too, right? And the Turks are there. I kid you not. I kid you not.
Oh
They're,
no,
they
I
all
know
look
you're
like they're
serious.
dressed like Attila the Hun. They
It's
have like leather and fur with, swords and a bit of armor. They literally are dressed like Attila the Hun. And he's courting them, right? He wants a cut of this. He thinks that for Turkey, that's the better way. And what is he seeing? He's seeing a industrialized Europe that is subservient to America, and he knows America expects the same thing from him. And
the
he
Turkic
has to
man will
join a
not be
bloc
broken.
that's going to be better for Turkey and for himself.
Yeah, that's it's yeah that I can't really add anything to that beyond co-signing it. So, uh,
The video is hilarious. Tajiks,
oh, it's
Uzbeks,
yeah,
Turks,
it's amazing.
Turkmen, and Hungarians. The horse archery, the whole thing. The,
It's
the
like
feathers in their caps, and it's hilarious.
it's like when they include Romania in like the Latin bloc countries, where it's yes, it technically belongs there, but in by any realistic observation, it has no place there. Like that's a, you know what that's unfair because I it, I I'll just leave it at that. But
Yeah.
it just yeah, there's not really a way you can put it, but you can just tell that something is very strange, although it is technically correct. But just a couple pieces of Middle Eastern news before we get into some of the things about Iran that happened. The recent breaking news as of today. So you have Azerbaijan is cutting gas to Nagorno-Karabakh, while Armenia is also Armenia's color revolutionary, I say I shouldn't implicate the entire nation of Armenia, are demanding that Russian forces leave once again. So you can see the attempt to try to open up that second front in the Caucasus once again, and Armenia continues to get squeezed out by the hand of its color revolution government and its supporters who continue to want to kneecap the nation. And I'll say once again, by the end of the century, Armenia will not be a state, and that the Armenian people will be a stateless people who are completely in the diaspora. Not that I want that for them, but that is the direction it's heading, and unless there is a rapid course correction within the next few years, if there's not a rapid course correction before the end of the decade at the latest, the Armenians are done as a nation for the foreseeable
They're done. And
history.
Pashinyan's
Yeah.
people want Armenia out of the CTSO, and they believe they're better off sticking with the gay. Really, there's not much that can be done uh, with leadership like that. I don't know what to say. I mean, Russia doesn't really want it. Russia is now entangled in a major war. It's limited to what it can do.
Yeah, Armenia has shot itself in the foot when it came to the Pashinyan government and decoupling itself from Russia to the point where we even saw all the way back in the 2020 war a large amount of the problem they had were with the drones, which we'll get into with some of the news out of Iran. That Syria had been able to cope with the same sort of drone attacks because of integrated air defense systems with the Russians, something Pashinyan's government directly refused when Russia offered it to Armenia
It's
around 2018.
so stupid. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. It's frustrating.
Yeah, it is, but I figured with that being said, we should get into some of the Iran news. And I'll let you take over it from here because you actually broke this story to me.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, it's too early to tell. Um, there are conflicting reports. One of the crazy reports was Israel was doing this. This is now we said at the beginning of the show that this comes on the heels of the largest air defense exercise between America and Israel in their history, right? Okay. Where are they flying? I mean, Israel's a small country, so whatever. You can make of that what you want. It's important in some ways, yes. Um, the fact is, we don't know, right? So far, there are no reports of any casualties. Uh, uh, Attempted to create a coup, with all the crazy girls, like all of that passed, right? Some of those guys who killed some of the police, they've been executed, right? Um, and of course the West was crying about that. Oh, they executed. I mean, well, I mean, if the people on January the 6th started executing police, and then those guys got killed, just this kind of hypocrisy always drives me nuts. In any case, I think that time has passed, right? This is more of a nuisance than I would say the regime is about to fall. And I do think it's supposed to coincide with not only the exercise, but about a day or two ago, Russia, there was another plane that flew from Tehran. And because it was a few days ago, these are more, UAVs, drones, suicide drones. Apparently, these have a more powerful explosive than the previous gen. Um, so I think it's that. Now, it's probably MEC. MEC is one of the few communist parties that America supports.
Yeah, it's that
But
they're
America's
yeah,
not going to quit agitating in this area. You mentioned Bolton. Bolton is very proud of America's involvement in the terrorist attacks in Iran. Um, but the thing is this is not a full-scale war. Yes, as they should have, the Iranians have scrambled their jets. Remember also that the Iranians have received their first Su-35s. They're going to get other Sus as well. Su-34, Su-30, or 31. Um, and for all we know, Russia is, I mean, listen, Iran is very capable. They have very good engineers. But if Russia wanted to, they could indicate that they're helping Iran ramp up their nuclear development. I mean, they're protecting some Iranian interests. So in one way or another, they do facilitate that. And uh, um, in any case, I think Iran is too big and important a player. And now it does have vulnerabilities. Obviously, we saw that the entire fall. But I just don't. I think this is just fumes. These attacks are not sophisticated attacks. You remember when the war broke out last year and Iran sent like 9 cruise missiles and they blew up that area where like Mossad had headquarters in northern Iraq, where it's all Kurdish. Uh, if it's something like that, then I think you worry. But these drones don't even appear to be like military grade, so they can be effective. The Yemenis have figured out how to how to do that. Although from what I've seen so far, I don't even think that they're as sophisticated as the Yemeni stuff. It worked. They got through. The Iranians were sleeping. Something happened. But it's still dangerous. It's still destabilizing the country. However, um, this is not like some all-out attack. I don't believe like Iran is going to fold.
Yeah, I would tend to agree that these are just pinpricks at this point to
Yeah,
tie down the Iranian state rather than collapse it, and that any attempt at collapse at this point, especially after the months of protests have failed to really rock the regime, would require direct U.S. military action, probably also within coordination with Israel as well. So, in terms of Iranian regime change, it would have to be through a direct war, in which case I thought that chapter was closed, and I suppose the Iranians do actually develop a nuclear arsenal that is infinitely less likely to happen. Or we could see, with the direction things are going, it could take the exact other way where,
it's inevitable.
oh, yes,
Yes,
where,
it's inevitable. Iran's going to have nukes, and there's nothing the West will be able to do about it.
yeah. And unless they're willing, and unless we have somebody brazen enough to do some sort of small scale tactical nuke first strike on Iran, which I don't foresee happening, don't get me wrong.
I don't either,
Uh,
and they're afraid because it's not like Iran in 2008, 2010. Iran now has S-300 systems. Those days are gone. They're gone. They have very good jets. They will be able to do standoff attacks where they never even have to leave Iran to do successful attacks on American bases in Iraq, even in Syria if they so choose, right? Um, like I say, those days are gone. So that's probably the reason why there is so much effort by the Americans to like fund terror, like the terrorists who've been there for decades and decades, of course, in Iran. Um, and why they're trying to stir up trouble with the Kurds and the Azerbaijanis population, because at least one of the drone strikes was in an area that is primarily Azerbaijani. But I don't, this is futile. Like it's not going to change anything.
oh, I would agree, and I expect more of these type of attacks. I don't think that they will be enough to shake Iran, but it'll be enough just once again to be enough of a nuisance to keep them temporarily delayed in whatever they may be doing. Now, with that being said,
Mm.
do you want to get into the leaked memo regarding U.S.-China
Yeah, we
relations?
could do that too. I know we've already spoken a lot about it, and maybe follow up just briefly with Victoria Newland's comment. There's just two or three takeaways that I have from that I think are very interesting. Um, yeah, but to get to the Rand memo, so the Rand memo came as a kind of a surprise to me, right? I think that Russia has been significantly weakened. Now, I think that's a lie, but I think they have to say that because I think the overriding concern is that no matter what, America can't stay as focused and involved in helping Ukraine as it is. The other thing that they say, though, of course, is a political turnaround is completely unfeasible. And that's true. They've spoken too much. Um, I've discussed this with my brother. Like everybody that is head of a state in the EU and in America and in Canada, anybody in NATO, like they would almost all have to go. They would all be completely discredited, including Biden. Um, there was also a mention that the elections are coming as well, and people have speculated that China might go for, or the RAND doesn't include this, of course, but the China might go for something around 2024. But it's suggesting that America needs an off-ramp, that it believes that the Russians are willing to negotiate, and that this would be the best time to do it. Of course, in a few years, America can resume where they started. It doesn't say that, but we know that's what would happen anyways. It does acknowledge that Europe has been significantly weakened as well, and that America has only been slightly weakened. But if it prolongs the war, it will be more significantly weakened, and it will embolden China. Um, there are also elections in Taiwan, of course. Again, it doesn't mention this. I'm mentioning it. In we don't know how things are going to go in Taiwan. I would imagine that America will do everything possible to make sure that they try to have a government that wants to secede from China. Um, I mean, ultimately, um, it has to be that there are Pentagon officials and generals who are saying that they can't keep going this way. They could, but they would have to let go of China. That's my take on it. The Rand Corporation believes that it would be better to start focusing in on China, but that they could do far more damage that way. Now they just talk of that as reputation, but I'm talking about them cutting off like the Maldives, increasing tensions between China and India. There are other ways to hamstring the Chinese rather than focusing on Ukraine. So it's I don't want to get too much further into it because I still want to talk about Newland, and it's a long program. But many of the, like I said, many of the arguments don't make sense, right? It does mention that Ukraine is going to be able to take Crimea, but if the war goes on a little longer, Ukraine could get more territory, but that this would not make much of a difference, or that Russia will gain more territory, which again negates the idea that Russia has been significantly weakened, right? So there's these contradictory arguments because the overall message it wants to say is get out, right? Get out, but I can't tell you the reasons to get out because if I did, it would look like, I'm a Putin shill, or maybe we're not doing as well as we'd like, or the protracted effects on America's reputation being in this theater. But then how do you do it? In a sense, the Rand Corporation itself doesn't give because it says it's politically inexpedient for them to change course right away. So if there were negotiations, they would be huge. They would be, I suppose, very well televised. But that would mean a narrative would have to be put in place why this is good, right? Again, that would be hard. So these are just my suppositions, right? On the other hand, if a deal was kind of worked out, they'd have to be pretty silent about it. They would have another issue that would have to be a distraction. That's how it would have to happen. Um, but essentially, I just look at the Rand report as, because remember they're the guys who authored to overextend Russia in late 2019, right? It's the
Oh
same
yeah.
guys, and now they're saying we should get out, but we have to do it very delicately and very professionally, so we don't have egg on our face. Because if we stay longer, we'll have more egg on our face. We we cannot afford to lose the not just the president of the United States, but all the other leaders that have like blabbed on and on about Ukraine, how they've made it like I mean, it's the biggest hype ever. Um, so they would how they're going to manage this, I don't know, but that's that's um, that's the report.
Yeah, and I would love to once again do what we did with the article that we went through from the Jamestown Foundation with that Rand report or just
Uh,
any in the future because I feel like after a certain point those articles just really need to be picked apart. But that was a pretty
yeah,
good that was a pretty
that
good
would be a
summary of it.
program in
Yeah.
itself. It would be great to have George McMillan back.
Oh, absolutely. And hopefully, yeah, we can arrange something like that in the future. But yeah, sometimes those things just need to be picked through. But I think you did give a pretty good summary on that. And honestly, I couldn't really add that much myself to that. But I do have a some last items on Asian news. So just to war on the topics of memos, the U.S. China one is very brief, and this is from General Mike Minahan of
Hmm.
the U.S. And I'll just read briefly through this letter that got leaked. So let's see. It is memorandum for all wing commanders. Subject 2020 February 2023 orders in preparation for the next flight. Number one situation. I hope I am wrong. My gut tells me we will fight in 2025. Xi has secured his third term and set his war council in October 2022. Taiwan's presidential elections are in 2024 and will offer Xi a reason. U.S. presidential elections are in 2024 and will offer Xi a distracted America. Xi's team, reason, and opportunity are all aligned for 2025. We spent 2022 setting the foundation for victory. We will spend 2023 in crisp operational motion building that foundation. If you want to know the operational motion I demand look at the total force team Charleston did in January. Number two, commander's intent: go faster, drive readiness, integration, and agility for ourselves and for joint force in order to deter and, if required, defeat China. This is the first of 8 monthly directives from me. You need to know that I alone own the pen on these orders. My expectations are high, and these orders are not up for negotiation. Follow them. I will be tough, fair, and loving in my approach to secure victory. Number three, end state: a fortified, ready, integrated, and agile joint force maneuver team ready to fight and win inside the first island chain. Maximize use of force and tools we currently have. Extract full value from things that currently exist. Close gaps, C2 navigation, maneuver under attack, and tempo. Risk, number four, risk. Run deliberately, not recklessly. You will be governed by the principle of calculated risk training, which you shall interpret to mean avoidance of death, serious injury, and Class A damage to attain high or readiness, integration, and agility. If the tactic, technique, and procedure you are developing increases AMC's ability to fight and win inside first island chain, move out. If you are comfortable in your approach to training, then you are not taking enough risk. Number five, OT&E. Attached are OT&E efforts from the 2022 Fall Phoenix Rally, which will guide our preparation but are not intended to limit creativity of approach. This is not all-encompassing list. I expect you to move briskly on the monthly tasks, anticipate projected tasks, and weave them eloquently into your unit's training and operational battle rhythms. Number six, February. A. All AMC aligned personnel with weapons qualifications will fire a clip into 7-meter targets with the full understanding of unrepentant lethality matters most. Aim for the head. And once again, for the YouTube people, that's in context of this memo. I'm not advocating anything. B. All AMC personnel will update VRED. C. All commanders will acknowledge this order directly to me immediately. Then all then report all 2022 accomplishment preparing for the China fight and forecast major efforts in 2023 through command chains by COB, 28th February 2023. Number 7, March, projected. All units will report progress on OT&E requirements for Indobacom operations discussed and reviewed by Fall Phoenix Rally. B. All AMC personnel will consider their personal affairs, whether a visit scheduled with their servicing base legal office, to ensure they are legally and prepared and ready. C. KC 135 units will coordinate to provide a conceptual means of air delivering 100 off the shelf type and UAV from a single aircraft. Once again, April projected. Number 8A. All units will report their integration and operation for Mobility Guardian 2023, include all events, lead in, and concurrent that they wish to fill. And finally, number 9, AMC/A3 will formalize these orders in Frago format. Completion progress, reporting format, and advancement measures driven and collected by our AMC/A3 team through ARC, NAF, and EC leadership. Once again, a lot of jargon, a lot of acronyms, but in short, that is just his brief outline for preparation for conflict with China, and that is Millihan, a four-star general, saying that he anticipates that conflict by 2023. So they are ramping up, and I would predict that if they cannot succeed in dealing some sort of blow to Russia within the course of 2023, that will likely be what they're going to do going forward. Now, how much stomach the American populace will actually have for a major full-scale war, I don't know. Maybe it'll just be, and once again, that referred a lot to air engagement. Maybe it will just be an air and naval engagement. Maybe it will just be an air engagement vis-a-vis Taiwan. But ultimately, I think they do anticipate some sort of at least small-scale confrontation with China, if not greater, and that is what they're going to set their sights on for the near future if Ukraine turns out to be a failed project, which increasingly looks like it is, especially if things continue on the current trajectory.
Right. And, there's some interesting facts. China is right now to become the second largest car exporter in the world, right? They're still the most industrialized country in the world, and they have far more economic and financial leverage than, say, going up against a country like Russia. And I mean, China ultimately is the prize for the U.S. And if you read what he says with the RAND report, that's when you get the full picture. That's when you understand what's motivating the RAND report in the first place, right? It knows this. It doesn't mention this, but it knows that this is probably coming, or this is a concern that America should not put off any longer. The other thing is, of course, an off ramp could be the Russians wanted all of Ukraine and they didn't. They got this little spit of land to connect Donbass to Crimea, and it cost them 100,000 men to do it. Good for you. Look, whatever. It's possible. It's possible. It's possible that the war will resume with China, and that's when Ukraine, that will be the other issue, and that Ukraine loses the spotlight. Because I think they're presuming that if there's a war with China, Russia is going to militarily help them. And
Oh,
if they can't
absolutely.
help, right. So that's how I think this is going to shape out.
Yeah, and especially when it comes to a China conflict, even a lot of the people who are less hawkish on the Russia question will likely be at least more in favor of confrontation with China. Now, when pen is put to paper and the confrontation actually breaks out, we'll see how that actually does play out. But in terms of initial support, I believe that even more so than Ukraine, that people will rally around a confrontation with China. Now, whether that happens once again is very contingent. I would have to see. I would have to save that prediction for at least 2024 to see what the state of everything looks like then. But ultimately, it's not out of the realm of possibility, which is more than I could say for it even just a year ago. But I do have
Mm-hmm.
one last piece of news, one last piece of minor news out of East Asia, and that is that Japan has downgraded COVID to the same legal status as the flu. So,
Yeah.
once again,
Yes.
you get this gradual peeling back of these restrictions across the world. Now, although you do have some countries trying to revive this in terms of trying to put pressure on China and saying that new Chinese strains have broken out and trying to really revive this as a point for a new Cold War, it does generally seem that the trend is continuing with restrictions peeled back, and perhaps it's the optimist that is still just barely alive within me saying that 2023 might be the year everyone just shuts up about this. 3 years might be
Mm.
the hard limit people have for this in terms of the pandemic state and everything that has come attached to it, especially if tensions do continue across East Asia and Ukraine. That focus will be shifted, and although a lot of focus was shifted away from COVID in 2022, it still lingered, and I still think a part of it will always linger. But I think in terms of any mainstream attention, and perhaps once again this is too optimistic on my part, that 2023 will see the end of any sort of mainstream uh, discussion, acknowledgement, or hysteria about it.
Yeah, it's possible. Certainly China could be the off-ramp for Ukraine, right? In a way, America has guaranteed that there will be no more any no direct mutually beneficial cooperation between Russia and Germany. They've want that relationship. They've wanted to personally insult Russia, right? Um, there was even a write-up in the Atlantic. I can't get into it. A Ukrainian friend of mine sent it to me, and it's like, bro, I'm not a boomer. Like, fuck, just don't send this. I didn't say it, but like, this woman is going on about how she has to reevaluate Dostoevsky and male-female relationships because in Tolstoy and Pushkin, the woman is always lives for the man, and then it's like, well, you know, like all
Talk
of
to a
Western
woman.
literature has this, like, um, yeah, because you know what, in the 19th century, women did live for the family and for the husband, right? Like that, that's just a fact. You
Yeah,
know,
it's
um, societies where that didn't happen, that they didn't go too far. In a sense, the Industrial Revolution made a lot of those gender roles irrelevant, right? And well, we have trans stuff now, but I don't want to go too off on a tangent, right? But again, it's there like we their culture as well. It's really not that good, right? You know what? Um, blame for all of World War II and the Holocaust. They're just as much to blame as the Germans, and so on. So that's been seeded, right? That has been seeded, and I've talked on the show before that in many ways, because the war has gone on for so long, there are fewer regions in Ukraine that are actually waiting for Russia to liberate them, and they're just more enemies now. Um, it's not ideal, of course. America would have preferred that the coup in 2014 was successful. They would have gotten Crimea and the nukes that are there, and then that would solve the problem of arming Ukraine with nukes, because now Ukraine would have nukes, and all, that beautiful scenario didn't happen. But um, there's an ongoing divorce between China and America, and America's going to have to change direction. So China could be the off ramp that doesn't exist in any other way, because that would save the political structure, right? That would not have to lose face, and Ukraine recedes as an issue. I mean, if anything, they'll have more like cops bad protests and whatnot. Not that they aren't bad. You know, that varies. Whatever. You know what I mean? Another Floyd thing. Like, if they want to hype up some domestic issue as the greatest domestic issue ever, they can do it if they wanted to.
Yeah, and that they can always find something, and I mean it's inevitable that they will find something else, and where they will take this, I can't say for sure, but all I know is that we're probably going to see within the next few months, and I mean ultimately, final thoughts for the show is that barring direct Western intervention, Ukraine is more or less done now. Will that be like a consistent Russian victory and Russia wins within a week to a month? No. It's going to be a gradual process. It is a hot conflict right now. But barring a full scale Western intervention, Ukraine is done. It does seem that they are looking to divest in that and focus on a potential Taiwan conflict right now. But I would say what's most likely is that, given the meetings that are going on in Israel and given the recent events in Iran, that they're trying to reopen the possibility of war with Iran. And I will say that's just really going to be contingent on whether Iran gets its nuclear deterrence first. If they do, the war is saved off. If they don't, then we could see an actual war with Iran. And I would actually speculate what the meaning about right now is that they might finally go through with the constantly threatened strikes on Iranian nuclear sites in order to prevent something like that. And I'm not saying that will happen, but I'm saying that seems like the most likely military action taken by the U.S. in the near future is strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities in conjunction with Israel.
Yeah, they would have to. I mean, I know what they want. They want like a large contingent of the population against the regime, against the Ayatollah, uh, particularly the Persian population. Without the Persian population, it can't be done. If they do that in conjunction with like massive airstrikes, if they're successful, remember, they may not be successful. Israel doesn't make the flights into Iran and attack the way it used to, right? And Iran and Syria are not the same thing, because Israel cannot do standoff attacks on Iran. It has to fly over Iraq, and that's when it becomes vulnerable. Iran will not hesitate to shoot down Israeli jets over Iraq, whatever America thinks about that.
Oh,
Even
absolutely not.
America won't go into that area. So um, I would say that yes, Iran could be like another theater, but the easiest off ramp is another war theater to deal with Ukraine. I think America has always known all along, and I said it on the show weeks before the invasion, that Russia financially does not have the wherewithal. Um, to reinvent Ukraine, take all over all of Ukraine, and like rebuild everything that's been blown up. Like it's just not there. And I mean, throughout the entire Soviet era, of all the regions in Ukraine that got the most amount of money, it was Galicia. It was Western Ukraine. You can even see the gradation from Western Ukraine to Central Ukraine, and Crimea and the Donbass and South Ukraine got the least amount of money. You go to the Baltic states, we got the most amount of money. The only places in Russia that got like decent money was St. Petersburg and Moscow. Everything else was thrown aside. So that whole like, I don't know, STFU money or, please like us money, however you want to call it. I mean, of course, a lot of the leadership of the Soviet Union was of Ukrainian or part Ukrainian stock anyways. Um, Khrushchev's wife was from Galicia. So, it didn't work then. It's not going to work now. What you need is a clear definition, because I think what's happening now, it's obvious that um, there's a divorce, and it's permanent between Russia and Ukraine. Um, Ukraine is another Slavic country that wants to be European. It does not have a vision independent of that. And frankly, that's something that even Russia has always struggled with as well. But Russia has a firmer idea of what it is outside of a European context.
Yes, and I would co-sign on that. And really, that well, once again, I think you put it very succinctly, and there's not really much I can add to that. And if you have any final thoughts for the show, certainly now would be the time.
Okay, so the only thing I was going to say is Victoria Nuland.
Oh yeah, go
Um,
ahead. Absolutely.
uh, um, interesting thing about her, I'll only say a few things, and that is uh, she mentioned at the committee that she was speaking to in Washington that she was incredibly gratified of the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. Uh, she was almost like on the verge of saying, "Yeah, we did it, woo!" Um, the other thing is she mentioned Belarus, like that's still a sore spot. You can tell now what the ousting Lukashenko and taking over Belarus was perfect for what they wanted. Failed in Belarus, and because this has given Russia an enormous edge, an enormous um, escalation possibility. Um, Part of the invasion of Ukraine, of course, happened from Belarus. Belarus is so close to Poland, it would give, God forbid, um, less time for NATO to act, should it come to that. However, Belarus, of course, allows the Russians to directly monitor what NATO is doing in Poland. I won't get into the whole, we're still speaking to the government in exile, Tihomovskaya, blah, 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 the Guaido of Belarus. But I thought that was particularly interesting that Belarus should have been part of this pact. Psychologically, it would have had an effect on Russians as well. They would have felt more isolated if that had happened. But it didn't. And so, anyways, those were the two big takeaways that I remember. She honestly thought Rand Paul was talking to her. It was one of the clips. Um, he was suggesting like legislative um, in the legislative areas of sanctions that they should lift them. These he means like politicians who are essentially lawyers, and to begin a dialogue. and she thought he meant like, oh, we'll unsanction some of them, and then Russia will give some of the land. And he's like, no, I didn't mean that. I wish it was that simple. So like some of these people really are delusional. Like they are crazy. They are delusional. I'm really becoming convinced of that. Like her reaction was a very natural reaction, you know?
Oh, I would say, especially
So
a lot of the people like Newland are uh, completely delusional and fully buy into this. Now, I don't deny that there are people there for power's sake, and again, that's a debate you can have all day and night that I won't get into right now. But Newland, especially, and her crowd, they do think it is that simple, and it's almost a childlike naivete on their part that you would not expect from people who are in the positions that they are. And Newland, as much as I cannot stand her, continually fascinates me as a person. Ever since 2014, I don't know. There's just something so brazen about someone like her that you
yeah,
almost find fascinating. But that's
you could almost say a lot of chutzpah.
but I'll just leave it at that because those are the only YouTube friendly thoughts I have on somebody like Victoria Newland, and that's all I had for the show. So thank you everyone for tuning in.
Yeah,
After our little brief gap in programming due to my brief vacation, so we hope to see more of you in the future. We'll certainly have more episodes, and I don't think things are slowing down anytime soon. So we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
goodbye and take care.